Have you ever stood in a place so quiet you can hear your own pulse and wondered what was listening back? Out here, winter doesn't bring snow the way people imagine. It brings distance, miles of empty salt flats, mountains that look close enough to touch but take hours to reach. The land feels calm at first, beautiful, even, but the longer you're in it, the more it starts to feel unfinished. Like something ancient is still deciding what it wants to be. The nights stretch wider than the maps admit. Radios crackle and then go dead. Footprints last longer than people do. If you've ever been near a place like this, you already know the feeling. And if you haven't, listen closely. My name is Evan Calder, and I'm a park ranger assigned to Death Valley National Park, Winter Operations Sector, Eastern Range. I've worked this desert for 14 years. One ranger covering nearly 70 square miles on some shifts. No backup for hours, sometimes days. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong, because there are things you learn out here that aren't in the manuals. Things they don't teach at the academy. Things you can't put in an incident report, because officially they don't exist. I've rewritten this report more times than I can count, and every version leaves something out. Not because I want to, but because putting it all down feels like crossing a line I was trained to respect. There are things you're supposed to observe, document, and move past. And then there are things that follow you home. I'm telling you this now because winter in Death Valley strips away the noise. The tourists leave. The heat loosens its grip. What's left is a land as it was long before us. And maybe, in some ways, before rules mattered. I've enforced closures, recovered bodies, and spent nights alone with nothing but a radio and the dark. But what happened last winter doesn't fit any category I know. If you ever wonder why certain areas stay closed long after signs fade, this might explain it. This isn't easy to share. But once you know, you start noticing things too. By the time winter settles into Death Valley, the park changes hands. Not officially. There's no ceremony, no memo that says this place no longer belongs to visitors. But those of us who stay feel the shift immediately. The crowds thin out, the radios go quiet, and the rules stop being suggestions. On paper, winter operations are straightforward. Certain roads close when temperatures drop or flash flood risk increases. Titus Canyon, Echo Canyon, sections of the West Side Road, locked behind gates with laminated notices explaining seasonal hazards. Backcountry permits are still available, but the language changes. Strongly discouraged. Experienced hikers only. Radio check-ins move from optional to mandatory. Every 4 hours when you're out of your vehicle. Every 2 if you're alone. Miss 2 check-ins and search protocol begins, whether you want it or not. That's the version you can find online. What you don't see are the margins. The parts that never make it into visitor guides because they sound unreasonable or worse, superstitious. Those rules don't get printed. They get whispered during shift changes, passed along in clipped sentences while you're refilling coffee or signing out a satellite phone. Don't camp in the low basins after the first cold front. If the wind stops completely, turn back, even if the sky is clear. And never, ever push past dust just because you think you can make it. No one explains why. Not directly. They'll say things like, terrain gets weird out there, or GPS acts up, or my least favorite. It's just not a good idea. When you're new, you assume it's institutional caution, liability avoidance. The same reason warning signs exist everywhere else in the country. But after a few winters, you realize the tone is different. This isn't about slips or dehydration. It's about places that don't behave the way they should. We're understaffed year-round, but winter exposes that reality in ways summer can hide. On paper, Death Valley has dozens of rangers. In practice, winter nights often mean one ranger covering an area larger than some states' counties. One vehicle, one radio, and a backup time measured not in minutes, but in hours, if the roads are even passable. Policy says you rely on procedure. Reality says you rely on instinct. I remember my third winter, standing in the operations office while my supervisor went over closures. He didn't read from the checklist. He looked at me instead and said, "If you feel like you shouldn't be somewhere, trust that feeling. The paperwork will sort itself out later." That was it. No elaboration, just a look that told me not to ask. Most visitors think closures are about safety, and sometimes they are. Flood damage, rockfall, unstable ground. Reasonable explanations that make people nod and turn around. But if you've ever ignored a warning sign, stepped past a barrier because it felt arbitrary, ask yourself why it was really there. Because some signs aren't meant to protect you. They're meant to contain something else. Winter amplifies that truth. The land gets quieter, and in that quiet, patterns emerge. Tracks linger longer. Sounds carry farther. You notice how often people misjudge distance, convince a ridge is closer than it is. How frequently radios lose signal in places they shouldn't. How often search calls start with the same phrase. They said the area fell off, but they kept going. Officially, when someone goes missing, we follow protocol. Establish last known point. Assess weather. Deploy resources based on risk. Unofficially, there's another step, one that never gets written down. We ask where they went, not just how far, because there are places that take more than they should. No one uses that language, of course. We say things like high-risk zone or geological anomaly, but the effect is the same. Certain coordinates trigger a different response. A longer pause on the radio. A quiet recalculation of whether we're sending people in or waiting for daylight. Or, on rare occasions, calling off entirely. Those decisions haunt you. Every ranger carries at least one name they wonder about. Someone they might have reached if they'd pushed harder. Or someone they're not sure they should have found at all. Isolation makes those thoughts louder. Winter shifts are long and silent stretches. You spend hours driving roads where the landscape doesn't change, listening to your own breathing and the low hum of the engine. You start talking to yourself just to prove your voice still exists. And when you do see another person, another ranger, a lone hiker, it feels unreal, like a glitch in the scenery. That isolation breeds reliance on things training doesn't cover. Smell, pressure changes. Winter doesn't create danger in Death Valley. It reveals it, pulls back the illusion that this land has been tamed, categorized, reduced to signage and trails. Beneath that surface is something vast and patient, something that doesn't acknowledge our systems or respect our boundaries. We adapt because we have to. We make rules that sound arbitrary because the truth would be harder to accept, that there are forces older than our presence, older than our language, shaping this place in ways we barely understand. By the end of that winter, the one I'm trying to explain, I realized the rules weren't about control at all. They were about coexistence, about knowing where not to stand, where not to sleep, where not to stay too long staring at the horizon, waiting for the land to make sense. Because some parts of Death Valley don't have names. And once you start noticing that, you can't stop seeing them everywhere. That was the winter. I learned the map was incomplete. And that realization, the gaps, the blank spaces, would lead me straight into one of them. Once you accept that the map is incomplete, you start seeing Death Valley differently. Not as a park or even as terrain, but as a series of surfaces layered over something much older. Winter makes those layers visible. The heat, haze is gone. The air sharpens. Distances seem clearer, until they aren't. The salt flats stretch out like a frozen sea, white and blinding under the low sun. Badwater Basin in winter looks peaceful from a distance, almost inviting, but standing out there feels like stepping onto the exposed bones of the earth. The ground crunches faintly under your boots, each step echoing too loudly in the open space. There's no vegetation to soften the scale, no movement unless the wind decides to remind you how small you are. Beyond the flats, dried lake beds crack into geometric patterns that look deliberate, as if something pressed them into place and then left. The canyons cut deep into the rock, wind-carved corridors where sound behaves strangely. A single footstep can travel far enough to sound like someone else walking behind you. Radio static bounces off stone walls and comes back warped, stretched, unfamiliar. Winter light makes everything flatter. Shadows linger longer than they should. Ridges blur together, and the sense of depth you rely on starts to slip. You think you're closer to a landmark than you are. You swear you've already passed a bend in the canyon, only to find it waiting ahead again. At first, you chalk it up to fatigue or bad angles. Everyone does. But after enough time out there, the explanations were thin. There are places in the park we refer to by coordinates only. No trail names, no interpretive signs, just numbers and quiet understanding. Visitors ask why certain areas don't have names, and we tell them the truth, sort of. Some features were never formally designated. Some names were lost. Some places don't need labels to be respected. What we don't say is that naming implies ownership. And there are parts of this land that resist that idea entirely. The Timbisha Shoshone have lived alongside this valley far longer than the park has existed, and the rangers who last out here longest learn to listen without asking too much. There are stories tied to specific basins, specific canyon mouths, stories that aren't meant to be repeated casually, not because they're secret, but because repetition strips them of context. Power, even, we're told to respect that boundary. So we acknowledge the stories without retelling them. We note the areas they reference. We don't linger. That's the agreement, unspoken but firm. Winter is when those boundaries feel closest. The absence of people makes the land feel occupied in a different way. Not hostile, observant, like it's aware of being watched and is quietly watching back. That's when the distortions start. It's subtle at first. A salt pan that looks half a mile wide takes an hour to cross. A canyon wall you've driven past a dozen times seems closer to the road than you remember, crowding the shoulder. You mark a rock formation as a reference point during a patrol, glance away for a moment, and when you look back, it feels off, not moved exactly, just not aligned with the memory in your head. Rangers joke about Death Valley math, distances that never add up, time that stretches. We laugh because the alternative is admitting we don't fully understand the space we're responsible for. And understanding is the currency of authority out here. I used to rely on Aaron when things felt uncertain. Aaron was my partner for 5 winters. Steady, methodical, the kind of ranger who knew every back road and could navigate by silhouette alone. He had a way of grounding situations, of making the strange feel manageable. If I questioned a reading or a route, he'd double-check it without judgment. If he hesitated, I listened. He transferred out in the middle of a season. No warning. No long goodbye. 1 week he was there. The next his locker was empty and his name scratched off the shipboard. Officially, it was a family decision. Burnout. A better opportunity closer to home. That happens in this line of work. But Aaron never liked talking about leaving. The last patrol we worked together was uneventful on paper. A routine winter sweep through a series of unnamed canyons. Just coordinates, radio check-ins, and a lot of empty space. I remember him stopping the truck longer than necessary at one overlook. He didn't say anything, just stared out at the valley floor like he was counting something only he could see. On the drive back, he asked me if I ever felt like the land was rearranging itself when we weren't looking. I laughed it off, told him it was the light, the season. He nodded, but he didn't smile. After he left, I found myself noticing the same things he had. The way certain basins felt heavier, like pressure building before a storm that never came. The way my internal compass hesitated in areas I'd patrolled for years. I started second-guessing routes, double-checking maps I knew by heart. Quiet unease replaced the calm I'd once felt in winter. Not fear. Fear is sharp, immediate. This was softer, more persistent, like standing on ground that might give way, but never quite does. The land without a name presses in on you like that. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, vast and patient, indifferent to our attempts to define it. And the longer you work out here, the more you realize that indifference is the most unsettling thing of all. By the end of that season, I understood why Aaron left without looking back. Some realizations don't fit neatly into a career built on clarity and control. Some knowledge doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you aware of how fragile your footing really is. Winter doesn't reveal monsters or miracles. It reveals perspective. It reminds you that this land has endured long stretches without us, and it will again, that our presence is temporary, our authority conditional. And once you accept that, you start noticing when something or someone fails to leave the same marks others do. That was a thought in my mind when the first missing hiker report came in. Not panic, not urgency. Just a quiet recognition that the land without a name had been crossed again, and that this time it hadn't let go. The report came in just after sunrise, and at first it sounded like every other winter call we'd handled before. Solo hiker, late 30s, day pack, plenty of water, no emergency beacon. Last seen signing the trail registered 2 days earlier, destination listed as a vague loop through unnamed terrain east of the main road. Not reckless, not prepared enough to be comfortable. The kind of case that usually ended with dehydration, a twisted ankle, or an embarrassed rescue before nightfall. Routine on paper. I logged the time, confirmed the coordinates, and initiated the first stage of search and rescue protocol. Establish last known point. Check weather history. Verify road access. Radio ops acknowledged and assign me primary field lead until additional resources could be pulled from Furnace Creek. Estimate response time for backup. For the 6 hours, assuming conditions held. Winter gives you that illusion that you have time. I drove out alone, radio crackling softly with periodic check-ins. The valley was still, the kind of stillness that feels earned after years of heat and noise. The hiker's vehicle sat where it should, dust undisturbed, tires cooling in the morning air. No signs of distress. No obvious missteps. I noted everything, snapped photos, followed procedure. From there, the trail dissolved quickly. It wasn't a marked route, just a suggestion etched by previous boots and weather. I followed it on foot, calling out at regular intervals, my voice sounding thin against the open space. The radio logged my position every 15 minutes. Ops confirmed receipt. Everything normal. Until it wasn't. I found the tracks less than half a mile in. Clear impressions in the soft crust of the basin floor, headed north, steady pace. They looked good. Too good. The spacing was consistent, unhurried, as if the hiker knew exactly where they were going. That alone wasn't concerning, until the tracks began to do something I couldn't reconcile. They drifted, not abruptly, not sharply enough to suggest a change in direction, just a subtle curve, pulling away from the terrain that made sense and angling toward a low basin we quietly avoided during winter patrols. A place without a name, marked on my map only by coordinates and a mental note I hadn't wanted to think about since Aaron left. Protocol says you follow the tracks. Protocol doesn't account for intuition screaming at you to stop. I radioed in the deviation, kept my tone neutral. Ops acknowledged, asked if I intended to continue. I said yes. That was the right answer, the expected answer. And as my boots pressed into the same ground the hiker had crossed, I felt that quiet unease settle in, heavier than it had any right to be. The tracks didn't degrade the way they should have. No scuffing, no signs of fatigue. They remained crisp even where the ground hardened, as if the weight above them hadn't shifted. I stopped, crouched, ran a gloved hand near one impression without touching it. The depth was wrong. Too shallow for an adult carrying gear. I told myself it was a cold. A mile in, the radio signal began to warp. Not static, something worse. Echoes. My own voice coming back half a second late, stretched thin. Ops asked me to repeat my last transmission. I did. The echo followed again, slightly off. I adjusted position, raised the antenna, waited for the signal to stabilize. It didn't. Search and rescue timelines are built on probabilities, exposure windows, hydration limits. In winter, those windows widen, giving you false confidence. The hiker could still be alive, could be waiting somewhere ahead, conserving energy. That knowledge pulled me forward even as every other instinct urged caution. I rounded a low rise and lost the tracks entirely. They didn't scatter, didn't fade. They simply stopped, and at the edge of a shallow depression where the ground dipped unnaturally smooth. No signs of a fall, no scrambling, just absence. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the basin, try to understand how someone could vanish mid-stride. That's when the sensation hit me, the unmistakable feeling of being observed. It wasn't fear exactly, more like awareness, sharp and sudden, as if I'd crossed an invisible line. The air felt heavier, sound dampened. My radio went silent, not even static. I checked it, Tap the casing. Try to raise ops again. Nothing. If you've ever felt watched while completely alone, you understand why I hesitated. Protocol dictated my next move. Mark the location. Retreat to regain comms. Wait for backup. Instinct told me that stepping back might be just as dangerous as moving forward. That the basin wasn't empty, it was expectant. I compromised. Another violation I didn't log. I circled the depression slowly, eyes never leaving the center, searching for any sign I could justify. A scrap of fabric, a disturbed stone, something tangible. The ground remained pristine, unbroken. The longer I stood there, the more the landscape seemed to flatten, depth perception slipping the way it had in other unnamed places. The ridges felt closer, closing in, though I knew they hadn't moved. Finally, my radio crackled back to life. Ops asked for a status update. I gave them the facts, carefully omitting the parts that didn't fit. Lost tracks, unstable signal, no visual on the subject. I recommended expanding the search perimeter at first light the next day, bringing in additional teams. They agreed. Backup was already en route. I retreated then, every step away from the basin feeling like resistance, like wading through unseen current. When I reached higher ground, the pressure lifted. Sound returned. The valley looked the way it always had. Vast, empty, indifferent. By the time we mounted the full search, the basin yielded nothing. No body, no gear, no explanation that satisfied anyone who'd been there. Officially, the hiker was listed as missing, presumed lost to the elements. Another name added to the quiet ledger we keep, but never share. But I knew better. The land hadn't taken them violently. There was no struggle, no chaos. It had simply accepted them. The realization sat heavy in my chest, a weight I hadn't felt since Aaron's last patrol. As the teams packed up and winter light bled from the sky, I stared out toward the coordinates we'd avoided expanding into, the place where tracks ended without reason, where protocol had failed to provide answers. That was when I understood the next step wasn't about searching harder. It was about deciding whether we were willing to cross into a place we weren't meant to patrol at all. The decision not to expand the search didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like sediment sinking to the bottom of clear water. No one said the words out loud, but we all understood what was being left unspoken. There was an area beyond the last marked grid, a shallow basin ringed by low ridges, that none of us suggested pushing into. Not because it was officially closed, and not because it was technically dangerous in any way we could document. We didn't patrol it because we never had. The basin doesn't appear on visitor maps. If you look closely, you'll notice a subtle omission. Trails that curve away from it, contour lines that flatten unnaturally, a blankness where detail should be. The explanation we give when pressed is environmental sensitivity, unstable salt crust, fragile formations, risk of subsidence after winter temperature shifts. All of that is true in the way that a half-truth can be technically accurate while still avoiding the point. Internally, we refer to it only by a designation that never leaves our reports. No name, no shorthand, just a quiet understanding that this is not a place you wander into without a reason you're prepared to defend. I hadn't planned to go back there. After the hiker vanished, I told myself that protocol had been followed, that discretion had prevailed. But once you notice a pattern, it's hard to unsee it. The coordinates matched others I'd flagged over the years. Small anomalies I dismissed as coincidence. A malfunctioning GPS here, a delayed radio ping there, a patrol route that never quite felt right afterward. Acknowledging that pattern meant accepting what it implied. So I did what most people do when faced with something they don't want to name. I avoided it, took longer routes, assigned myself elsewhere, let winter pass with its quiet unease, and hoped the land would settle back into silence. It didn't. Equipment issues started cropping up more frequently near the basin's perimeter. Radios losing signal in clear line of sight. Compasses drifting a few degrees off north, then correcting themselves once you moved away. Even the truck behaved differently. Engine noise dampened as if the sound were being absorbed rather than carried. The first time it happened, I wrote it off as coincidence. The second time, I swapped equipment. The third time, I stopped logging the incidents altogether. That's the part I'm not proud of. There's a line between professionalism and self-preservation, and I cross it without meaning to. I told myself I was being rational, that without concrete evidence there was nothing to escalate. But deep down, I knew the truth was simpler. I was afraid that if I acknowledged the pattern formally, I'd be obligated to act on it. And acting on it meant entering the basin. Sound behaves differently there. I noticed it the first time I stood near its edge after the disappearance. The wind didn't echo the way it should. Footsteps seemed muted, swallowed by the ground. When I spoke, my voice felt close to my head, as if it couldn't push outward the way it normally did in open space. I tested it, clapped my hands, called out, listened. The sound dissipated too quickly, like it had nowhere to go. That kind of acoustic dampening doesn't make sense in a shallow, open basin. There were no canyon walls to trap it, no vegetation to absorb it. The rational explanation would be atmospheric conditions, temperature inversion, density layers. I repeated those terms to myself like a mantra, even as my instincts told me they didn't apply here. I walked a few steps in and felt the shift immediately. Not a physical sensation, but a mental one, a tightening, like trying to focus on something just outside your peripheral vision. The horizon seemed closer, the sky lower. My GPS lagged, then refreshed with position several meters off from where I stood. I backed out, and the readings normalized. That should have been enough to convince me to leave it alone. Instead, it convinced me that something was wrong in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I started reviewing old logs during night shifts, cross-referencing incidents that had never been linked, minor search calls, lost hikers who reappeared disoriented, unable to explain where they'd been, equipment failures clustered around the same coordinates, patterns that only emerged when you looked at them together. The realization brought a cold kind of clarity, and with it, fear, because patterns imply predictability, and predictability implies intent. I never told anyone about those nights in the office, combing through data with the lights low and the radio volume turned down. I never told anyone how often Aaron's name came up in those records, adjacent to anomalies that predated his transfer, or how the dates aligned uncomfortably close to his last patrol with me. That silence was a choice. One I justified by telling myself I was protecting my team, protecting the park, protecting the public from panic. But the truth was less noble. I was protecting myself from what acknowledging the basin fully might cost. Winter deepened, and the basin remained quiet. No new disappearances. No calls that forced my hand. Part of me hoped that whatever boundary existed there had been satisfied, that the land had closed back in on itself. Another part of me knew better. The place we don't patrol doesn't demand attention. It waits, patient, unmoving, confident in the knowledge that time favors it. That's the most unsettling thing about it. Not that it feels hostile, but that it doesn't feel urgent, like it knows will come eventually. I began carrying backup equipment, without logging it. An extra radio, analog compass, paper maps I hadn't relied on in years. Small, quiet preparations that felt both prudent and damning. Each one was an admission that I believed something was wrong, even if I refused to say it out loud. Standing at the edge of the basin one last time before the storm rolled in, I felt the same sensation I'd felt during the search, a sense of being acknowledged, not watched exactly, recognized, as if the land were aware of my hesitation, and found it acceptable. That was the moment I understood the basin was an anomaly. It was an invitation. And when the winter storm hit days later, cutting off roads, isolating patrol zones, forcing decisions to be made without oversight, I knew that the choice I'd been avoiding was about to be taken out of my hands. Because soon, going into that place wouldn't be optional anymore. The storm arrived faster than forecasted, the way winter storms out here always do. Without ceremony, without urgency, just a quiet tightening of the sky until escape stopped being an option. By late afternoon, visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile. Wind scoured the valley floor, lifting sheets of salt and sand into the air until the horizon vanished completely. Roads closed one by one, gates locking behind me as I repositioned, each clang echoing like punctuation. By nightfall, I was alone. Ops had tried to pull me back before the worst of it hit, but the last transmission cut out mid-sentence. The radio didn't go dead. It stayed on, humming softly, as if waiting for something to speak through it. Backup was grounded. Vehicles couldn't move. The park, for all practical purposes, had emptied itself of everyone but me. Then the call came in. A faint emergency ping from a satellite device. Weak, intermittent, but unmistakable. Coordinates blinked onto my screen, resolving slowly, stubbornly, until they settled into a location I already knew by heart. The unmarked basin. The place we don't patrol. Procedure was clear. Shelter in place. Wait for conditions to improve. Do not attempt field operations during a winter storm, especially alone. Every rule I'd spent years enforcing lined up neatly in my head, forming an argument I desperately wanted to accept. But the ping repeated. Not steady, not rhythmic, almost hesitant. Like it wasn't sure it should be calling at all. I checked the timestamp. The signal had been active for less than an hour. Whoever triggered it was alive. For now. I thought about Aaron then, not as he was at the end, quiet and distant, but as he'd been before that winter. Confident, certain, the kind of ranger who believed that doing the job meant showing up, no matter the cost. I remembered his voice asking if the land ever felt like it was rearranging itself. Remembered how I dismissed it. I couldn't do that again. I logged a brief note. Storm response deviation. Possible life-threatening emergency. And shut the computer down before I could reconsider. The truck protested as I drove. Engine straining against the wind. Tires fighting for traction on ground that no longer felt solid. Snow didn't fall so much as it hovered. Suspended in the air. Blurring distance and depth until the world narrowed to the beam of my headlights. By the time I reached the basin's edge, the storm had swallowed everything else. I stepped out of the truck and was immediately struck by the silence. Not the muffled quiet of snowfall, but something deeper, heavier. The wind still raged above, but inside the basin it felt insulated, as if the storm were skirting around it rather than passing through. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. Each step felt delayed, like the ground was deciding whether to accept my weight. The radio crackled once, then went completely still. No signal, no static, just dead air. I crossed the boundary without ceremony. No marker to acknowledge the shift except the sensation of pressure returning, that familiar tightening behind my eyes. The basin stretched wider than it ever had before, scale distorted by the storm's low ceiling. The GPS struggled to update, freezing for seconds at a time before jumping ahead, placing me several meters from where I stood. Time began to misbehave. I checked my watch repeatedly, watching the second hand stutter, then resume. Minutes passed too quickly, then not at all. I felt like I'd been walking for hours, and only moments simultaneously. The emergency ping pulsed faintly, always ahead of me, never closer than it had been when I started. I called out, though I knew better. My voice dropped into the ground and didn't come back. No echo, no reflection, just absence. The silence pressed in until memories surfaced unbidden. Aaron standing at that overlook, counting something I couldn't see. His locker empty the next morning. The way he'd avoided my eyes during our last conversation, as if he was already halfway gone. I wondered, not for the first time, if this was the place that had convinced him to leave. The thought steadied me in a strange way. If he'd faced this and walked away, then maybe I could face it and walk back. The emergency signal flickered again, stronger now, and I followed it into the heart of the basin. The ground here was unnaturally smooth, untouched by wind or drift. No tracks, no disturbances. It felt less like arriving somewhere, and more like being allowed closer. That's when the sense of scale collapsed entirely. The ridges at the basin's edge seemed both distant and impossibly near. The sky felt lower, pressing down, stars obscured by cloud and movement. I lost any reliable sense of direction, compass needle spinning lazily before settling on a heading I knew was wrong. I was completely cut off. No backup, no radio, no exit I could trust. The ping stopped. I stood there, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to run, to do anything but remain where I was. But there was nowhere to go that felt safer than staying still. The silence thickened, almost expectant, and for a moment, a terrible, intimate moment, I felt certain that whatever existed here was aware of my presence in a way that went beyond observation. Not hostile. Curious. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had lost meaning, stretched thin and translucent. When the signal finally returned, it wasn't ahead of me. It was behind me. That was when I realized I had made a mistake far greater than breaking procedure. I'd assumed the basin was static, contained, a place you entered and exited along predictable lines. Standing there, with the storm sealed around me and every instrument failing, I understood how wrong that assumption had been. The basin wasn't something you searched. It was something you were already inside. And whatever had sent that emergency signal hadn't been trying to lead me forward. It had been drawing me in. As the silence deepened and the storm cut off every path I knew, I felt the last illusion of control slip away. The rules, the protocols, the careful avoidance, they'd all been barriers I'd leaned on without understanding what they were holding back. Now, alone in the heart of the basin, I knew the next moment would decide whether I left this place at all, or whether I became another absence someone else would one day try to explain. I wish I could tell you there was a moment when everything became clear. A sound, a shape, a realization that snapped the fear into focus. There wasn't. What happened next didn't arrive like an event. It unfolded like an absence, expanding until it filled everything. The silence deepened first. Not louder, not heavier, just more complete. The storm noise vanished entirely, as if the basin had sealed itself away from the rest of the world. Even my breathing seemed optional, something I had to remember to do. I stood still, because movement felt like a decision I might not be allowed to undo. Then something shifted behind my eyes. Memories surfaced that weren't tied to the present moment. Aaron's voice again, closer this time, not as a recollection but as a presence. He said my name the way he used over the radio. Flat, professional, reassuring. I turned before I could stop myself. There was no one there. The basin hadn't changed, but my sense of it had. The space felt crowded without containing anything visible, like standing in a room where the furniture had been removed, but the impressions remained. I became acutely aware of where I wasn't looking, where my attention wasn't focused, and that awareness felt noticed. Another voice followed. Not Aaron's, my own. It came from my left, repeating the last thing I'd said aloud minutes earlier. Same cadence, same breath pattern, wrong timing. The sound didn't echo. It replicated perfectly, without distance or distortion. Hearing yourself from outside your body does something fundamental to your sense of reality. It loosens it. I stopped speaking. The ground responded. I don't know how else to describe it. Not movement, more like acknowledgement. The pressure shifted, redistributed, as if something massive had adjusted its weight. My boots sank a fraction deeper into the surface, though the ground remained smooth and unbroken. I realized then that whatever this was didn't need to show itself. It was defined by effect, not form, by what changed in its presence. Sound, memory, direction. The rules that made the world navigable began to fail, one by one, like instruments losing calibration. I tried to orient myself by logic. I checked my compass again. It spun once, then settled, needle pointing toward a ridge I knew wasn't north. I looked up at the sky for reference and found it featureless, clouds smearing any sense of movement or depth. The basin felt larger now, or perhaps I felt smaller. Scale had become subjective. Another sound came. Footsteps. They circled me slowly, deliberate and measured. I didn't see them. I didn't feel vibrations. I only heard the rhythm, matching my own gait from earlier, as if the basin had recorded me and was playing it back. When the steps stopped, they were directly behind me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to confront whatever was there. That's what training teaches you. Identify the threat. Face it. Control the situation. I didn't. For the first time since stepping into the basin, I did something that felt completely wrong and completely necessary. I sat down. The footsteps ceased immediately. The pressure eased just slightly, enough for me to realize that movement itself was a form of engagement, that every step I had taken had been a question, and the basin had been answering in its own way. I lowered my gaze, focused on the ground between my boots, and slowed my breathing until it matched the stillness around me. I thought of Aaron again, not his disappearance, not his fear, but his restraint, the way he'd pause at that overlook, sensing something without challenging it. I wondered if that pause had been the only reason he'd walked away at all. The voices didn't stop. They changed. Memories surfaced out of order. Training scenarios I hadn't thought about in years. Conversations I'd forgotten having. My father's voice long gone, calling me inside before dark. Each sound carried the same clarity, the same intimacy. None of them belonged here. I understood then that this wasn't mimicry meant to deceive. It was reflection. The basin wasn't creating anything new. It was rearranging what already existed, stripping it of context and offering it back without explanation. A catalog of human presence, replayed without intention or emotion. Ancient, not because it was old in the way we measure time, but because it operated outside of it entirely. I stayed still. Minutes or hours passed. Time no longer progressed linearly. It pulled, stretched. The emergency signal pulsed once more, faint and distant, no longer directional. I realized with cold clarity that it hadn't been a call for help. It had been residue, a trace of someone who had stood here before me, leaving behind just enough of themselves to register. Not alive, not dead, simply recorded. That understanding broke something in me. I let go of the need to make sense of it, let go of maps, procedures, outcomes. I focused instead on something simpler, presence without assertion. I existed there without asking anything in return. Slowly, the basin responded. The pressure lifted further. The sounds faded one by one until only the wind remained, distant, familiar, returning from wherever it had been held at bay. The compass needle steadied, trembling before aligning correctly. The emergency signal went dark. I didn't move until I felt certain that remaining still was no longer required. When I finally stood, the basin felt empty again, vast, indifferent, unchanged. But I wasn't. The walk back to the truck felt shorter, though I knew it hadn't been. The storm had begun to ease, visibility returning in cautious increments. My radio crackled back to life as I crested the basin's edge, ops calling my name with strained urgency. I answered. My voice sounded like my own again. I never saw anything. No shape, no entity, no moment I could point to and say this is what I encountered. And that's the hardest part to explain. The encounter was defined entirely by what it removed: certainty, orientation, delusion of control. I survived not by fighting, not by understanding, but by stepping out of the way. The consequence of that choice followed me out of the basin. I carry it still. Because once you learn that the land can reflect you back to yourself, without mercy, without judgment, you realize how thin the boundary really is between presence and disappearance. And in the days that followed, as reports were filed and explanations drafted, I began to notice something else. The basin had let me leave, but it hadn't let me go. The first thing they teach you after an incident is how to write it down, not what to feel, not how to sleep afterward. Just how to translate experience into language that could be archived, referenced, and, when necessary, forgotten. Dates, times, coordinates, weather conditions. Deviations explained in neutral phrasing. Emotional responses omitted entirely. I wrote the report 3 times. The first version was honest. It never left my desk. The second was cautious. It didn't survive review. The third was acceptable. In the final version, the storm accounted for everything. The signal malfunctioned due to atmospheric interference. The basin search was aborted because conditions deteriorated beyond safe operational limits. No contact was made with the missing party. End of narrative. Recommendations followed. Sign here. No one asked me to lie outright. They didn't have to. The structure of the process did the work for them. There is no checkbox of the land behaved incorrectly. No feel for absence exerted pressure. Anything that doesn't fit the form simply falls away. The missing hiker was reclassified from active search to presumed deceased within 72 hours. Resources were reassigned quietly. The basin remained unmentioned by name or designation. On paper, nothing extraordinary had happened. Operationally, things changed almost immediately. My patrol zone was adjusted. Subtly, routes reassigned, winter coverage redistributed, so I no longer passed near the basin during routine checks. It wasn't framed as punishment or concern, just logistics. A normal response to a difficult incident. I accepted it without protest. Because that's the other thing they don't teach you. When to stop asking questions if you want to keep your badge. The guilt settled in after the adrenaline wore off. Not sharp, not overwhelming. Persistent. A low pressure that followed me through empty offices and long drives. Guilt for the hiker, whose signal had led me in. Guilt for Aaron, whose departure I now saw in a different light. Guilt for surviving something I couldn't explain while others hadn't. Isolation deepened. Colleagues were polite, professional, careful. Conversations stalled when I entered rooms. Not out of hostility, out of uncertainty. No one wanted to be the one who acknowledged the parts of my report that hadn't made it onto the page. I didn't blame them. I started dreaming about the basin. Not vividly, just impressions. The sense of scale shifting. The feeling of being paused. I'd wake unsure how much time had passed. Convinced I'd miss a check-in that no longer applied. Sleep became another place where orientation felt unreliable. Out in the field, I noticed changes I couldn't document. The land felt thinner. That's the only word that fits. As if the distance between places had compressed slightly. Patrol drives felt shorter, but left me more exhausted. Sounds carried differently, sometimes arriving before their source was visible. I'd crest a rise expecting to see open valley, and instead feel the same pressure I'd felt at the basin's edge, only for it to fade once I passed. Nothing dramatic, nothing reportable, but consistent. I found myself thinking about Aaron often, not the way you remember a colleague, but the way you reconsider a decision you once dismissed. His abrupt transfer, his silence, the way his name appeared in old logs near anomalies I'd once ignored. I reached out to him once, drafted a message, rewrote it, deleted it. What would I say? I think you were right. I think the land noticed you. Some realizations are too heavy to drop into someone else's life without warning. I never sent it. The basin remained closed unofficially. No signage, no announcement, just continued omission. It didn't need guarding. People naturally avoided it once routes shifted. The land seemed content with that arrangement. Authority became complicated. Supervisors treated me with a careful distance, respectful but alert, as if they were deciding whether I was someone to protect or someone to monitor. I was asked more than once if I felt fit for winter operations going forward, if I needed time away, if I wanted reassignment. Each question carried an unspoken alternative. Do you want to keep working here? Being believed has a cost. Staying employed has another. I chose the latter, knowing exactly what I was giving up. I stopped volunteering information, answered questions precisely and no more, learned where the boundaries were, and stayed within them. But belief doesn't disappear just because it isn't voiced. It settles into behavior. I stopped lingering near unnamed places, stopped pushing routes past dusk, stopped correcting visitors who said the valley felt strange in winter. Instead, I listened, let them speak, let their discomfort exist without explanation. The land continued to change in small ways. Instruments lagged where they hadn't before. Radio delays increased, especially near areas adjacent to the basin. Nothing actionable, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. I began to suspect the encounter hadn't been contained, not escaped, not expanded, acknowledged, like a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The hardest part wasn't fear, it was restraint, knowing something fundamental about the place I worked and being unable to act on it openly. Carrying that knowledge while performing a role built on confidence and clarity. Visitors still ask questions. Why is that area closed? Why does the map look unfinished there? I gave them the approved answers. Environmental hazard, preservation, safety. Sometimes, late in the day, I'd almost add more. I never did, because the consequence of my encounter wasn't trauma in the way people expect. It was awareness, a quiet, persistent understanding that the land doesn't operate on our terms, and that sometimes survival depends on recognizing when you're no longer the one being tested. Winter passed. Spring followed. The basin remained quiet. Too quiet. And that was when I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. The land hadn't reacted to my presence out of curiosity or indifference. It had responded because I'd entered it alone. The next time it drew someone in, I doubted it would be content with just one witness. And when that happened, I knew the choice I'd made to stay silent, to stay employed, would no longer be enough, because some aftermaths don't end with reports. They wait, in the months after everything's settled. After reports were filed, routes adjusted, and the base returned to its quiet omission, I found myself moving through winter differently, slower, more attentive, not because I was afraid of what I might encounter again, but because I understood now that winter wasn't something happening to the park. It was something the park used to speak. That distinction matters. People think of winter as a threat out here. Cold nights, flash floods, isolation. They imagine it as an obstacle layered onto an otherwise stable landscape. But winter doesn't add anything to Death Valley. It removes. Heat fades. Crowd vanish. Noise thins out. What remains is a land in a more honest state, less mediated, less accommodating. Winter reveals what's always been present. I started noticing how differently visitors behaved during the colder months. They spoke more quietly, asked fewer questions, walked slower, even when conditions were ideal. There was a reverence that crept in without instruction, as if the absence of people made space for something else to assert itself. I never corrected that instinct, because the truth is, Death Valley doesn't need interpretation in winter. It doesn't need signs or stories layered on top of it. The salt flats, stretched white and endless, don't ask to be understood. The dried lake beds, cracked and ancient, don't care if you photograph them or pass them by. The canyons, sculpted by wind and time, don't react to admiration. They endure. That endurance is easy to romanticize until you spend enough time alone with it. Until you realize that endurance implies continuity beyond us. That the land has witnessed long stretches without human presence, and will do so again without difficulty. Winter makes that fact impossible to ignore. I began to think of my role less as a guardian and more as a witness. Someone passing through a system far older and more stable than any agency or designation. The authority we carry, badges, protocols, maps, is temporary scaffolding. Useful, necessary, but not foundational. The land is a foundation. That understanding softened something in me. The guilt didn't disappear, but it shifted, became less about responsibility and more about humility. I stopped asking what I could have done differently and started asking what I had misunderstood from the beginning. Winter had shown me that some places aren't dangerous because they're hostile. They're dangerous because they're indifferent. They don't adapt to us. We adapt to them or we don't. I thought often about the hiker whose signal had drawn me into the basin, about the trace they'd left behind, not as a presence, but as an impression. Winter preserves impressions longer than any other season. Tracks linger. Disturbances remain visible. Absence itself becomes a kind of mark. That's the part that stays with you. You start to recognize that human activity doesn't always register the way we expect. Sometimes it fades quickly. Sometimes it imprints too deeply. Either way, the land decides what persists. I noticed fewer instrument issues as spring approached. Radio stabilized. GPS lag diminished. The basin remained quiet, its edges softened by distance and time. It would have been easy to believe that whatever had happened was complete, resolved by inaction. But winter doesn't resolve things. It clarifies them. I found myself drawn to the margins of the park, the areas that never make it into brochures or guided tours, places without names, without trails, without stories attached. Standing there, I felt the same quiet pressure I'd felt before, but without fear, more like awareness, a reminder of scale. Humans are temporary here. That's not a warning. It's an observation. Our structures weather quickly. Our records degrade. Our presence, no matter how assertive, leaves only partial traces. Winter accelerates that truth, stripping away the illusion of permanence we carry in busier seasons. I began to understand why certain stories are told sparingly, not because they're forbidden, but because repetition risks misunderstanding. Some knowledge isn't meant to be circulated endlessly. It's meant to be encountered once, held carefully, and then allowed to settle. That's what winter offers, if you let it. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't require interpretation. It simply reveals what remains when comfort and distraction fall away. If you ever visit in winter, notice what the park doesn't advertise. Notice the roads that curve without explanation, the areas without signage, the way certain trails feel heavier as the light fades. Pay attention to where your instinct tells you to stop, even when nothing appears wrong. Those instincts aren't superstition, they're recognition. I continued working through subsequent winters, though never again alone during a storm. Staffing improved slightly. Technology advanced. Procedures updated. On the surface, everything moved forward, but the land didn't. It waited, not in anticipation, not with intent, just in continuity, the same way it always had. I stopped thinking of the basin as an anomaly. It wasn't a breach in the system or a flaw in our understanding. It was a reminder that the system itself was incomplete, that maps are agreements, not truths. That authority is borrowed. Winter doesn't create mysteries in Death Valley. It uncovers them. And once uncovered, they don't need escalation or spectacle to persist. They exist quietly, patiently, until someone crosses a boundary without realizing it's there. As another winter approached, I felt that familiar tightening. Not dread, not fear, but readiness. The kind that comes from knowing you're not the most important thing in the landscape, and that survival sometimes depends on remembering that. The basin remained out of sight, out of mind for most, but I knew better than to believe it was finished. Winter had shown me what the land reveals, what it keeps. I was about to learn next. As winter approached again, I was asked, politely, carefully, not to talk about certain things. Not directly. No one said, don't warn people. They didn't have to. The expectation was implied in policy meetings and rewritten guidelines, in the way certain questions were redirected, and certain areas remained conspicuously absent from public materials. Silence, I learned, is often framed as professionalism, and for the most part I complied. I enforced the closures, repeated the same explanations I'd been given: environmental hazards, preservation efforts, seasonal instability, all of it true enough to pass scrutiny, all of it insufficient to convey what mattered, because rules out here aren't just about preventing accidents. They're about boundaries. So this is what I can say, and what I was never instructed on how to explain. If a road is closed in winter, don't drive around the gate. Not because the terrain is impassable, but because the closure exists regardless of how easy the route looks. If a trail fades into nothing, don't assume it will reappear further on. Some paths end because they're meant to. If the weather clears suddenly and the wind dies all at once, turn back. Even if visibility is perfect, even if you feel fine, especially then. Don't camp in low basins after the first cold fronts. Don't push past dusk just to prove you can. And if a place feels unfinished, like the map gave up on it halfway through, don't fill in the blank yourself. These rules work best when you don't know why they exist. That's the part one was told not to say. People ask whether the threat is real, whether there's something specific to be afraid of. They want shape and scale, something they can name and avoid. But the truth doesn't work that way. Whatever exists here doesn't announce itself. It doesn't chase or stalk or hunt in any way we'd recognize. It waits, not dormant, not asleep, just patient, in the way landscapes are patient, in the way erosion doesn't hurry, but still reshapes mountains. I don't know if what I encountered is aware of us individually, or if we're simply noise passing through a much older system. I don't know if the basin responds to curiosity, intrusion, or mere presence. And I don't know whether it's satisfied by long periods of avoidance or simply indifferent to them. What I do know is this: nothing about it felt accidental. Since that winter, there have been no official incidents tied to the basin, no disappearances that couldn't be explained away, no equipment failures significant enough to warrant investigation. On paper, the threat, if you want to call it that, doesn't exist. And yet, the routes remain adjusted. Patrol patterns avoid certain overlaps. New rangers are trained with an emphasis on instinct that isn't written into any manual. When they ask why, they're told the same thing I was told years ago. It's just not a good idea. The land hasn't changed, but our relationship to it has. Subtly, quietly, in ways that don't register, unless you've stood at the edge of something you can't define and felt it acknowledge you in return. That kind of knowledge is heavy. It doesn't make you feel special or chosen. It doesn't empower you. It strips things away. Certainty, confidence, the comfort of believing every problem has a solution if you follow the right steps. Some knowledge protects you by keeping you alert. Other knowledge only burdens you by showing how little control you actually have. I carry both now. When visitors stop me in winter and ask what Death Valley is really like when no one's around, I tell them it's beautiful, which is true. I tell them it's quiet, which is also true. And sometimes, if they seem receptive, I tell them it's older than we think. I don't tell them what that age implies, because warnings aren't always about information. Sometimes they're about restraint, about knowing when to let the unknown remain unknown. If you've listened this far, you might be tempted to look for the basin, to compare maps, to find the gap and step into it, just to see for yourself. That impulse is human. Curiosity built everything we're proud of. It's also what leads people into places they aren't prepared to understand. I won't tell you where it is, not because I couldn't, but because location isn't the point. There are places like it elsewhere, zones of omission, areas shaped by forces that don't align with our expectations of cause and effect. Death Valley just happens to be honest about it in winter. The park will continue to operate. Rangers will patrol. Visitors will come and go. The land will endure all of it without comment. And somewhere within that vastness, there will always be places that don't want names, don't want trails, don't want witnesses. Whether they're waiting or simply existing doesn't change the outcome. What matters is how you approach them. I was told not to give this warning because it doesn't fit into any safety framework. It can't be quantified or enforced. It relies entirely on the assumption that people will choose humility over curiosity. I don't know what that assumption is reasonable. All I can do is tell you what I've learned and trust you decide what to do with it. Some knowledge keeps you alive. Some knowledge keeps you awake at night, listening for silence to deepen. And some knowledge, once acquired, changes the way you see every empty place you pass through afterward. If you ever find yourself alone in winter, standing somewhere that feels too quiet, too unfinished, too patient, remember this. The land doesn't need you to understand it. It only needs you to know when to leave. That's the warning I was told not to give. And now that you have it, the burden of deciding what it means no longer belongs only to me.